Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast bonus. There's usually no book reading on these bonus episodes. These are interviews, rants, raves, insights, and other mild and sometimes sharp audio musings and conversations with interesting people about the topic of leadership, literature, philosophy, or any of the other things that we tend to talk about here on this podcast. Because listening to me and an interesting guest talk about leadership in dynamic ways and literature for a couple of hours is still better than reading and trying to understand yet another business book. One of the most underrated authors of the early 20th century is John Dos Passos. Now, we covered his USA trilogy on the podcast last year in episodes number 33, 34, and 35. So I would encourage you to go back and read the books, but also listen to the episodes, right? And we talked a little bit on those episodes about the impact of John Dos Passos on how we think about leadership and culture and the intersections with literature. And we got some feedback about those podcasts from folks from various sources, including one notoriously that told us, and we had asked this individual to come on the podcast as a Dos Passos guest to talk about his work. And he said infamously to us, quote unquote, no one reads Dos Passos anymore. Blinded by the light, or maybe drowned out in the light of his literary contemporaries who have long since passed into legend, folks like Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, and of course, the gigantic Jupiter in that universe of early 20th century post-World War I writing, Ernest Hemingway. Dos Passos, I consider to be, after reading his work, the classic writer's writer. He was not necessarily writing in the pursuit of broader public appeal, although I do not think he would have turned it down. No writer ever does. And he has been rejected, unfortunately, by the larger critical intelligentsia since his death in 1970 for the unpardonable sin of having campaigned for Goldwater and Nixon. See, you can't be part of the sort of socialist, progressive 1920s left and then see your country switch and then go in a different direction. Even with all that weight, his work really deserves to be stripped down, and it really deserves to be re-examined. And quite frankly, I believe to be fixed in the pantheon of works whose impact, whose ripples can be felt right now in the early 21st century. And so today on the podcast, I want to welcome our guest. Now, wait for it. You're going to hear the name and you're going to lose it in a minute. But I want to welcome our guest, John Dos Passos. Wait for it. Coggin. From his website, his biography is as follows. John Dos Passos Coggin was born in Annapolis, Maryland, and currently lives in Northern Virginia. He is a writer and environmental advocate. He has worked in clean energy and climate communications in the Chesapeake Bay region for 15 years. He writes nonfiction and fiction. He has published many articles on film, music, books, politics, and public policy. His poetry has appeared in Aurora, Zenda, the Blue Mountain Review, Cathexis Northwest Press, that's a great name, and Panegyris. His nonfiction has appeared in The American Scholar, Climate.gov, the Baltimore Sun, and the Tampa Bay Times. In 2012, he published his first book, Walkin' Lawton, an authorized biography of Florida Governor and U.S. Senator Lawton Chiles. He also writes feature film screenplays, close quote. By the way, just as a side note, I read his article, and we're going to talk about it today, that he most recently wrote on his grandfather, John Dos Passos, and his passion for fishing in The American Scholar. And that's how I got a hold of this fine young man to talk with him on the podcast today. And by the way, just to prove to you that he is a real person, if you go to look at his Twitter file, or his Twitter profile, sorry, he's also a huge Batman and Marvel fan. So that should give us something to overlap and discuss today. In addition, we are going to, and this is sort of a a last minute change, or maybe not change, but addition. We are going to talk a little bit, I think, about Robert Oppenheimer, which is timely because of the Christopher Nolan film that is coming out, or I'm sorry, has come out this weekend as of this recording. So, with all of that being said, welcome to the podcast, John. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing good. It's good to be here.
So, for our listeners, I know I gave you that intro, and I talked a little bit about the things that are on your website, but that doesn't encompass everything. So, in your own words, for our listeners, what is it that you do exactly?
I do a variety of things, and I'm lucky to do all of them. I have a wonderful job working for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the Washington, D.C. area, where I work on climate communications. One of the flagship publications of our office is climate.gov, where folks across the country can access plain language, authoritative information on climate. And I'm really proud of the work we do. I love it. And then on top of that, I have this great passion that is in the family for creative writing of all kinds. I think something that is maybe in the Dos Passos gene pool is a love of variety. Variety is the spice of life, and my grandfather was always in the midst of many projects, many thoughts, somehow keeping them all in balance. He was a very balanced individual, and I love variety too, and especially when it comes to writing. I'm always looking to change things up a little bit, go from writing a poem to writing a nonfiction essay to writing a screenplay, and just enjoying how different everything is.
That's something that I have even noticed when I read biographies of people who have lived lives, long before my own. You can see that people were involved in multiple projects, right? This idea of being a generalist was way, way, way more prevalent. I would assert probably up until the 1950s and even the 1960s in America, before we fell down the rabbit hole of specialization, where I weirdly think we are at the end of specialization and we're actually turning the corner back to the reign of the generalists. And I think that's a good thing. People have multiple interests, people have multiple desires, and quite frankly, if you can run a farm, write some interesting poetry, do some interesting research. You can also maybe run a small, social media company on the internet, maybe a 2-person company, and you can also run for your local mayoralship. I wouldn't say run for Congress, but run your local mayoralship. Now you're being spread out in multiple areas, but you're also feeding yourself. And I think that's something that we missed in the middle of the 20th century a little bit, but I think we're getting back to that. So I like to hear that you're right there with me on being a generalist. You mentioned the Dos Passos gene pool, and this is not a question that I have on our list, but it is a question I'd like to ask. And we're just sort of popcorn a little bit, and we'll get to all the questions today. Not worried about that. How many folks are in the Dos Passos gene pool, and how many of them are writers? Like, when you all get together, what's that conversation like? I'm very curious. I'd love to be a fly on the wall with that.
Absolutely. I just grew up, when I was a boy, of course, I wasn't aware of the Passos lineage, the literary estate, but I was aware from an early age that choosing the right word at the dinner table was important. And it wasn't anything formal. It was just, that was just it was something my mom always cared about, and my dad, because my other side of the family, my dad's family, the Coggins, they are a big newspapering family. So my dad's father owned and edited a local newspaper in what's called the Northern Neck of Virginia. As soon as he got back from World War II, he started running the paper, and his grandfather ran the paper for him. So we've got writing and words on both sides of the family, and I just grew up and I didn't know why, but caring subconsciously about choosing words.
A well-timed turn of phrase, probably. I get a sense and you're a family just like any other family. You got your ups, you got your downs, you got your disputes, you got your conflicts, you also have your good times, your bad times, in your joys and your passions, and people are pursuing whatever it is they're pursuing, just like any other family. However, I would presume that a well-timed turn of phrase probably does pretty well in your household, right? That's probably the thing that like drives a lot of shall we say interaction and conversation. Would I be correct in assuming that?
That's right. I think there's just some enjoyment in our family of who can tell the best story at dinner, who really got people laughing, and just, and also the timing. Who told, if you tell a great story right when dinner's ending, then everyone, when they're leaving, that's what they're gonna remember when they go back to what they're doing, and then the next day they'll remember that story, maybe tell someone else about it.
There you go. I love that. Well, tell us a little bit about your work to preserve John Dos Passos's writing with the John Dos Passos Literary Estate and the John Dos Passos Society. Let's sort of front load some of that information early for our listeners. So tell us a little bit about your work, why you decided to pick up, that particular baton, why that's a thing for you out of all of the other folks who could have picked that baton in your family. Why were you the guy that decided to do that, and what is that work, right? What does the Literary Estate and the John Dos Passos Society actually do?
Sure. Well, I do have to fill out the picture. I have an older sister who's 6 years older. Her name is Laura. She teaches in public schools in Richmond, Virginia, and she's an exquisite writer. She has that talent that is broadly shared in our family. And actually, when we were kids, she was the voracious reader, and not just I read a lot, but she had the variety. She read fiction, nonfiction. If I were to go back in time and decide and guess which one of us was going to take the lion's share of the estate, it would be my sister, not me. And she's just now starting to she's kind of intermittently explored publishing and writing creatively over the years, and is now in a phase where she's working on a novel and getting strong into the literary life again. But so it was a slower burn, a kind of a late bloom for me. I did work on creative writing in high school. I was edited to the literary magazine, but then in college, I think I was still exploring the depth of this interest. Was this something that was lifelong? Where was this going to go? And like most college students, you're just using that time to explore yourself, figure out who you are. And then I think when college ended, I found myself, I think what people in many professions refer to as a calling, that feel these instincts that are almost transcend description. They're hard to comprehend sometimes, but feeling a sense of that there are stories that need to be told, and feeling, and also just realizing that this isn't work anymore. Somehow this is joy. This is a part of your personality, and I think, and that was what got the ball rolling. First working starting my Lot and Child's book was, I have these instincts. I feel drawn in an inexplicable way to the story. It's just magnetism that Lot and Child's like, and I have to try this out and see if this is who I am. I need to spend a year and explore this story and see if this is what I want to devote my life to.
Mhm. And we'll talk about the Lawton Childs book, because I'm fascinated by that, and sort of how you sort of stumbled upon a U.S. senator, which I guess that's not really hard to stumble upon. I could go find a U.S. senator. That's not a problem. Even back in the day, they were fairly accessible. That's kind of the point, actually. And it's interesting that we're talking about this in the month of July, because this is typically our month where we cover things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. We do a lot of talk about government during this month on the podcast, and so it's interesting that you wrote that book about Lawton Childs, and I would love to find out more about that. You mentioned that your sister was probably the one person in your family. Your older sister was probably the one that was on that sort of, as entrepreneurs will say, that J curve up and to the right. And I'm sure you probably felt when you were a kid that sort of took pressure off of you, right? And a teenager, right? So you kind of had a little bit more freedom to sort of do it because they already picked somebody, and I'm the second kid. And by the way, I'm the second child too. So, and my sister's 7 years older than me. So it's like, you're just hanging out. Like, having a good time here, right? Like there's no responsibility, and so you get to dabble, you get to explore. When you got it, was the Lawton Childs book the thing that got you into the literary estate work, or was it okay? And then how does that tie into the John Dos Passos Society? Like, how do those link those two things together for me in my head?
Sure. It was 2013, around the same time that I got started in earnest with the Dos Passos Literary Estate and the John Dos Passos Society. I was between full-time jobs in early 2013. I had just done the book tour for the Lawton Childs biography, and I had some time at home where I moved back home and was figuring out my next move career-wise. And around that time, my mom decided that she wanted to take a next step in formalizing the work of the literary estate by launching JohnDosPassos.com.
Okay.
So that really, I decided that would be something I would devote a lot of my time to while I looked for a new job, a new salary position. And part of my new passion for growing myself into the literary estate was that after having finished the Lawton Childs book, done the book tour, I decided, yes, this is me. This is, and at that point, my grandfather's work it somehow stopped being so abstract and distant anymore, because here I've been on a book tour, I've worked with publishers. If there's anything that brings all writers together, it's complaining about publishers and business of it. That's what they talk about when they get together. And so I just felt, I felt like I understood finally my grandfather in a way that I hadn't before. And it just gave me new urgency. And so over the course of, I'd say, a year and a half or two, we did all the work of hiring a designer, working with them to create JohnDosPassos.com. And around the same time, the newly formed John Dos Passos Society, the US and international academic body that's devoted to studying his work in a scholarly way, they reached out to me and invited me to their first conference, which was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The two co-founders were working in Tennessee, a professor and a PhD student at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and that began this wonderful relationship with the society, so it was really 2013 when things really started cooking.
Now that's interesting, because in 2013, that's when I founded my first business. That's when things really started cooking for me. I started kind of like you, kind of looked around and said, I have this handful of things that I can do. How can I best help people? Right. And that's really where it started. Like, I didn't know what people I was going to be helping. I didn't know how I was going to be helping them. I didn't know what direction that help was going to go in. And it's interesting, once you put in the 10,000 hours, you know, where you wind up at. If you told me back in 2013, hey, one day you're going to run across John Dos Passos' grandson and have a conversation with him, I would have said, get out of town. get out. That's insane. And I got to go to work. You're talking insanity, but that's what that work does, right? That's how those intersections begin to happen, and sort of putting things out there. And this is what we talk about with leaders, right? You never know, to paraphrase sort of from Tolkien a little bit, in Lord of the Rings, you never know what's going to happen when you put your foot out on the road, right? It's a dangerous, it can sometimes be a dangerous thing, but very often it can be a fulfilling thing. So I'm going to frame this next question sort of this way. As a reader, right? Obviously, I am a person I'm a fan of Hemingway. I'll just put it out there. I really like Ernest Hemingway's writing. I read The Sun Also Rises for the first time when I was probably 8 years old. I banged through that book. I did not understand any of the subtext at all. I just knew, like, the sentences were short. It was easy to read, and I got through it at the end of it, and I was like, okay, that something happened there, right? I didn't know what happened, but something happened there. And that was one of those books that I pretty much read once a year, every year, up until about the age of 25. And we'll cover The Sun Also Rises, interestingly enough, on this podcast in a few months. We're going to wind up on that shore. Finally, I've been kind of holding back on doing Hemingway, really jumping in on that, because he was a giant, right? Giant writer. But when you start exploring Hemingway's crowd, right? You run across, obviously, Gertrude Stein. You run across Pablo Picasso, and I'm an art guy, so I'd run across Pablo Picasso before. No surprises there, right? But then you start going maybe a little bit down to the second tier folks, and a little bit into the third tier folks. And I'm not saying that John Dos Passos was in the second tier or the third tier, but you start spreading out that network and that web of influence, and you start realizing that, oh, Fitzgerald had all these people that he was engaged with that were really very interesting. And Faulkner had all these guys that he was engaged with that was really very interesting. And you begin to realize that the concept of celebrity in literary circles isn't something that's unique to, or was unique to, just, the 1990s or the early 2000s, when Jonathan Franzen was going on Oprah and, and then eventually having a contre-trump with her. You realize that this is something that's been going on for a while now, right? And as I began to explore more of that, I eventually ran across John Dos Passos. But it wasn't until we read the USA trilogy that I really realized just how impactful this guy really is, or really was, in his writing. And so I think that is a common challenge, because Hemingway just sucks so much of the air out of the room when you talk about any of these writers from the 1920s. So talk with us a little bit about the challenge of keeping the work of John Dos Passos in front of the public eye, and talk in material ways about, what have you done to make this so? What are the efforts of the Literary Estate and the John Dos Passos Society? How has this kept everything to the forefront in the public's mind?
It's a great question. It's very tough to mm, mobilize and curate a legacy for a writer who um, had such a there's so many reasons behind why legacies suffer and fade away in the literary world. There's politics, of course. I think that's one factor that plays into um, his waning critical legacy in literature, is that um, for many decades in the US, the 20th century, the New York literary establishment that dominated who was reviewed and when, who was celebrated and when, was a leftist monopoly, essentially. And once my grandfather departed the left, broke with the left, it was a small world. Everyone knew each other. People took it personally, and those grudges remained for decades. And I think that not only kept him out of more literary fame and opportunities, but also out of Hollywood, because Hollywood was also dominated by the left. So he was, in a lot of ways, persona non grata, except to the people who knew him best, who embraced him his whole life. And his one of the things I admire most about him is the multitude and variety of his friendships that sustained him. No matter where people were in politics, he had so many different friendships. But so that there's, going back to your question, there's lots of factors in play. It's probably something that a lot of people could write PhDs about, how reputations come and go. A lot of people have studied George Orwell's reputation and how that kind of came from started at zero, and in a very humble way around the time of his passing, and just exploded into this mass of global phenomenon that's still here. And politics plays into that too.
And we're not a political podcast, even though our topics do. I mean, there's no way you can't do touch on politics and do touch on political things, right? We're also not a religious podcast, although there is theology, and theo just means the study of God, right? Right. Say the transcendent. We do talk about that here because I do think that's important for leaders to comprehend as part of the leadership universe, right? You may not agree, but you got to at least understand, right? And so politics, religion, the other big third rail is, of course, anything having to do with sexual matters, orientation, desires, whatever, right? And there are great literary books written in those spaces as well, which we have not touched on the podcast because I would like kids to listen to this, but they are there, right? And so those are the big three rails, right? Politics, religion, and sort of more intimate areas. When a writer goes down that road of shifting loyalties, right? He needs friends and she needs friends, right? And the thing that I think about when you talk about this is, gosh, and I get it, right? It was the Cold War. Like, I get it, right? Like I'm a fan of history, I'm an amateur historian as well. Historical periods fascinate me. I think it's an absolute utter tragedy that we don't take the Cold War more seriously and sort of the ways in which people broke and shifted and allegiances broke and shifted based on, were you a socialist? Were you a communist? Were you a quote unquote fascist? Whatever that might have meant in the Cold War and post Cold War context. Or were you just like, an anti-communist, which by the way, I would have been an anti-communist, right? But in the literary circles, these elbows seem to be really, really sharp. I mean, Jack Kerouac and William F. Buckley were roommates at Yale. Like when I found that out, I went, oh, okay, that's the game we're playing, right? And Buckley had Kerouac on his show and treated him well and asked him questions in that, patrician sort of upper west side sort of accents, that Buckley would put on. But then, Buckley turns around and of course infamously has Gore Vidal on, and there you go. Like we're off to the races, right? So you're right. Like a lot of this became layered with personal things and with personal sort of sharp elbows, as I mentioned. And Dos Passos seems to have been, at least near as I could tell from his arc, looking at it from the outside, seems to have been more of a victim than a perpetrator of this. Am I correct?
Well, I would say that he was very, very civil about the way he conducted his political life. He was the type of person who loved hearing the other side, and and that's again the variety. He had friends on the left, on the right. Yes, some of them, there were some breaks with over politics. Hemingway being a prime example. But even with Hemingway, they didn't completely sever contact. That's an important detail that shouldn't be underestimated. They still communicated, not in a huge way. They would just pass short letters back and forth until Hemingway died. He didn't like to bear grudges, and when Hemingway did die, he was really moved by that. He referred to, my mother distinctly remembers that my grandfather referred to him as a friend. He didn't call him anything besides a friend.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to tie this into USA Trilogy, and then we can move to our next sort of pillar of conversation. But there's another idea I want to sort of flesh out a little bit here. So when you read USA Trilogy or any of his other works, but it's most prominent in USA Trilogy, and I love that those series of 3 books, like they were, when I started reading them, in particular 42nd Parallel, I was stunned that someone actually had the guts to write this book in this kind of way. And we sort of explored the tactical setup of the book, which I'm, as a writer, I mean, I write books myself and I publish books myself, and we can get together and complain about publishers. I am my own publisher, so I complain to the boss, but he's not going to listen. He's a hard taskmaster. But when you look at the setup of the book, just how it's tactically put together and the speed with which it goes, it very much has that sense of Joan Didion. And I mentioned Didion, before we started recording here, but it has that sense of Joan Didion / Hunter S. Thompson / Gabriel Garcia Marquez reportage. Like it sort of has that sense of reportage, which comes directly out of Dos Passos's experiences, in that space. And just gathering knowledge, right, and gathering information. So it's written in a reportage sort of way. It's written in a rapid sort of function way. Literally, the first time I read it, I thought this guy would have loved Twitter. My God, like he would have, he would have, forget it. He would have written anything. He'd been tweeting all the time. He'd be fighting his battles on Twitter, because it was written in that sort of style. And so I thought, well, people who love Twitter should be reading this. This is the Twitter before Twitter, right? Well, you look at that, and then you go and you look at, and I loved it how you talked about sort of the letters that he wrote back and forth between him and Hemingway and the ways in which people communicated. And they were making an attempt, unlike folks on Twitter and in our time 100 years later, they were making an attempt to, I think, disagree without being disagreeable. And that is a function, yes, okay, you can say of polite society, which, I know that in your governmental work, you probably run across a lot of people who are very, very emotionally engaged with activism around climate. And I wonder if in the vacuum of other things, particularly transcendent belief, which is an idea we explore on this podcast, people take all that energy they used to have and now they're putting it into politics. And that's the fundamental break between us now and those folks back then, and I don't know what your grandfather believed or didn't believe. I don't get into any of that. But I just know there was something there that allowed them to disagree without being disagreeable. And at the end of what fundamentally, I mean, Hemingway's life was a tragedy, despite him being a towering literary giant and towering talent. He was haunted by nihilism and existential distress and couldn't get past it. And so, the drinking didn't do it, the womanizing didn't do it, the acquisition of stuff didn't do it, the fishing didn't do it, the writing of the books, heck, even a Nobel Prize didn't do it, right? Like none of it did it, right? And I think guys like Dos Passos and Faulkner, who were his friends, were trying to sort of disagree with that piece without sort of not driving over the edge, but just being disagreeable. Am I onto something here contextually? And that's a big idea that I sort of dropped on you, but am I sort of onto something contextually here?
I think so. It's very well in many ways he was of the lost generation, yet so much in common with the people you just mentioned, Faulkner, Hemingway, Fitzgerald. But in other important ways, he was even among that group distinctive and on his own unique path. And one way is his strong sense of moderation in all things. As you mentioned, alcoholism, self-hatred, the lifelong struggles with many haunting demons. Those were a big part of the lost generation. And it's always been a mystery to me. It's something I wish that for many reasons that I could sit down with him and talk about it, is how did he conquer his own demons? Because everyone has demons. I know that, for a lot of his life, it was the relationship with his father. How did he make sense of that? How did he move from feeling smothered and overwhelmed by a very dominant father figure to finding and reflecting on all the things they had in common, and coming to peace with that, which he did later in his life. But it's my grandfather lived to be 74, and tragically for his generation of writers, that was really an outlier, that would live that long and have the chance to have to see most of the 20th century in the way that he did. I mean, that was a generation with tremendous genius, talent, and a lot of demons.
Demons, yeah. No, I'd absolutely. I mean, I mentioned Tolkien already, and we've read Tolkien, we've read C.S. Lewis. Both those guys, same thing. Came out of the trenches of World War One, and I think one of the things I've often said, maybe not necessarily as much on this podcast, but I say to my personal life to folks, and again, as an amateur historian, I kind of study all this stuff. One of the most underrated wars in all of human history, I think, was World War One. We just sort of gloss over it and jump right to World War II for a whole variety of, at least in America, a whole wide variety of reasons that partially have to do with, and I'm going to use this term, even though it's overused, jingoism and a sense of American patriotism. There's a lot of chest thumping around World War II, but World War I was a linchpin event that sort of the ripples of that, you're correct, didn't fully go out, and I would assert aren't fully done yet. Matter of fact, just put it in historical context, when the United States went into Iraq, regardless of what you may think about the political aspects of that, I looked at that from a historical context and I went, once again, we're cleaning up. We're cleaning up after World War One. Just some more World War One cleanup. This nation that, okay, we cobbled it together. The European powers and the colonialists cobbled it together. Now we got to go in. We got to clean up somebody else's garbage 100 years later. But you see that because of World War One, right? And the ripples of that we're just not done with that. That's a hugely monumental moment in history, and it would be great if somebody would write something about that. I don't know, maybe like All Quiet on the Western Front or something. Oh wait, that's already been written. I'm sorry. So it's probably already done. All right. Anyway, moving on. So, in talking about how Dos Passos overcame his demons, how your grandfather overcame his demons, one of those tools, I think, was being outdoors and fishing. So I have the book Hemingway's Boat, because of course I do. But that's immediately what I thought of when I read your American Scholar article. But talk about the American Scholar article that you recently published on your grandfather's fishing and outdoor passion, and sort of how that ties in to some other things about him. Talk a little bit about that. And we'll, of course, have links to johndosPassos.com. We'll have links to all the places where you can get a hold of John Dos Passos Coggin, all his books, and of course the link to the article from American Scholar. But go ahead and sort of break that down for us a little bit.
Sure. Well, yeah, that was just a wonderful experience writing that magazine article. Everything about it was great. Working with the American Scholar editors, doing the research, and I'm just so grateful that it all happened. I think it was, looking back now. So the article came out this spring. I started writing it last summer. So about 12 months ago. But I think if I really think about it, the article was in the making for years. I think it was kind of like a outboard motor that took a lot of tugs to finally get in motion. And once it really started, that boat was moving. And the earliest seeds, I think, of the article were the stories that my mom told me about the legendary fishing family of Provincetown, Massachusetts, Mayos. Charlie Mayo was a close friend of my grandfather's. They probably, I can't say for sure exactly when they met, but it was probably in the early 30s when my grandfather and his first wife, Katie, had just settled in Provincetown. Very small town. If you can walk through Provincetown, I think the whole town is about a mile long. It's still today just a very small community, and so they got to know each other. And my grandfather loved everything maritime, being out on the water, swimming, sailing, and so he went on these amazing fishing trips with Charlie Mayo, who was many things on the water, but probably best known for his rod and reel tuna fishing. He would pull in these massive creatures out of the sea, and for years, all the anglers on the Cape, all through Massachusetts, would beg him for answers on, what's your bait, what's your tackle, what's your technique. And so I grew up hearing about the trips that my mother went on when she was a little girl, with going fishing with the Mayos, going on the big trip from Florida to the Bahamas, exploring the out islands. Charlie Mayo was an extraordinary navigator, and he had mapped out through just trial and error, many years of experience, these, what were at the time in the 50s and 60s, the out islands were still kind of uncharted, but he knew them, he knew the locals, he knew where to stop in here for good food and drink and so forth. So those stories were just kind of magical to me when I was a kid, and And I knew that Charlie had a son, also named Charlie, but he goes by Stormy Mayo, which is one of the best names I've ever heard. So
Best.
I I felt like there was a story that needed to be told about my grandfather's life in Provincetown, his love of fishing. There was this open space that hadn't quite been explored by the two biographers who wrote about my grandfather. And I very much wanted to interview and meet Stormy. And so I finally did. And he's a famous right whale specialist and works in right whale conservation on the Cape. And just a fascinating man. And I'm so lucky to have met him and heard someone who really knew, another person who knew my grandfather personally. Those memories are fading fast.
I love it that, the name is Charlie Mayo. I love that. I love that name. That's fabulous. It's sort of like something you would hear on a Seinfeld episode. Like Kramer would know a guy named Charlie Mayo, and you and Jerry would be like, really? Because I've never met any of your friends. Like, that just sounds made up, right? And then to double down, and the son, right, is Stormy Mayo. That's incredible. Charlie Mayo doubled himself, and that's just amazing. No, I love that. And in reading the article, all of that sort of bubbled up from the bottom, right? It came through in the way that you structured it. In hearing you talk about sort of the path to the article and then reading the article itself, I keep thinking I would watch this if this were a movie. Now, I might be the only person on the face of the planet that would do it. Okay, that's fine. But it's just like when I was reading about Hemingway's boat, I was like, this would be an amazing film, right? The kind of films that it would be a max $30 million movie, right? Maximum, right? Because you could do all the effects and whatever. The acting would be the thing, right? And of course, you could tie in elements of Dos Passos's writing into that, show him actually going through the writing process, sort of intercut it with I can't believe I'm writing the script here just verbally, but sort of intercut it with well, I'm doing the story treatment right now, but intercut it with scenes of him on the boat. You get Charlie Mayo as the character, then you have the little kid running around seeing this, engaging, bring your mom in. It's all these kinds of different dynamics that you can bring into that, but we don't make movies like that anymore, or we struggle. Hollywood struggles to make movies like that because of the MCU, who's warped everything. But that might be something that heck, I don't know. I might wander down that road myself. I might make that project happen, and your article sort of like jumping. It's like popcorning in my brain. Not like I don't have enough to do on my own plate there. Well, and that passion, right, really comes through in the article. And there's another overlap there which you haven't really explored. So, you're involved in the environmental space. We talked about it a little bit politically, but I want to leave that aside. But you're involved in the environmental space. The NOAA. Yeah, I put the AAs in there, but NOAA. And so was that another spot where you saw some overlap with your grandfather as well?
Interesting. Things nautical, maritime, those also are on both sides of the family.
Yeah.
That's my dad's family is from has deep roots in Virginia's Northern Neck, which is a waterman's paradise. Oystering, menhaden, blue crabs, all on the water. So that was, my earliest memories are of being out on a canoe, being out on a boat. So it's hard to separate that, my mother's side of the family and their maritime from my dad's. It's all a big factor in my childhood. I think I think it was something that I came to appreciate more as I worked with the Dos Passos Literary Estate and got a sense over the years of what has been explored about him and what hasn't.
Yeah.
Or the gaps, where are the misperceptions, and I think there's a broader misconception that I tried to do a bit of course correction on with the magazine article, which is that um, that this notion that my grandfather was somehow so reserved and so internal that he wasn't an active man. And Hemingway looms has such a big shadow as the outdoorsman of the lost generation. It kind of threatens to take up all the space, but the truth is that as I explore in the article, that my grandfather was an outdoorsman as well. They did a lot of adventuring together, and and it was something that stayed with him the rest of his life. He had a little rinky-dink sailboat that he would take out in his 60s and 70s. I called it the Nitwit because it was such a pathetic little wooden boat, but he loved it. And so I hope that readers have fun with the article as well as getting all these intellectual bits, because he had a great deal of fun in his life, and a lot of it was outdoors.
Right. No, I love that. Yeah. No, again, that's that idea of being a generalist, right? Big adventure, exploring a lot of different interests, engaging with the world, right? You don't just have to sit in a corner and noodle out books, right? There's all of this other stuff, going on. And quite frankly, as a writer, you need all of that, right? You can't just experience the world internally. There are some writers who have a strong enough internal life to be able to do that. I think of the writer Milan Kundera, who recently passed away a couple days ago. He seemed to have a very strong internal life, but he was also placing himself in opposition to sort of a world-beating ideology that sort of dominated his entire existence. So in that case, you can kind of do something like that, right? But that's rare, right? I think most writers have to. Well, I know even for my own writing, you got to get out. You got to get out there. You got to get after it. You got to have some experiences. You got to talk to people. You got to be curious. And yes, you're going to have your own opinions and your own thoughts and your own process. And at the end of the day, you got to figure out how to merge all of that together to get something coherent for people. And the only way you're going to do that is through experience. Speaking of experience, let's talk a little bit about you, because we talked a lot about your grandfather. We talked a lot about the work on the literary estate and the society. Maybe you could talk a little bit about misperceptions about your grandfather as well. But I want to kind of turn the corner a little bit and talk about the Lawton Childs book, right? So I had no idea, by the way, that this was even a thing until I sort of started poking around a little bit, went to Wikipedia, of course, and then started poking around on the internet. And I am the classic, like, I was the kid who sat on the floor and read encyclopedias. So I've said that on the podcast before. I'm that kid, right? I'm the adult version of that kid. So Google is the most amazing thing ever. I can click on a link and go here and go here and go here and go here. And 10 hours later, I haven't done any actual work, but I found out stuff about things that I wanted to know, right? And so you wrote a book about Lawton Childs, 1,000 mile walk across the state of Florida. And how that sort of engaged with and tied into his Senate campaign in the 1970s. Walk us through what was compelling about that story. Because when I think of somebody walking, weirdly enough, I think of Forrest Gump running across the country. I don't know why. I'm also a cinema guy, and we'll talk about movies in a little bit here. But like, I always have that image in my head of him like running with the beard, Tom Hanks running with the beard flying behind him. I don't know, I'm terrible. So that was not the image that I got in my head, by the way, when I was reading about this. So that's fortunate, but that's the tie-in for me. Those are the two contextual sort of spots in my brain that click together, the two synapses that click together, and I go, oh, okay, he was doing this. It wasn't that, and so disconnect those synapses in my brain and tell us the story of Lawton Childs and Walking Lawton and how you came to all of that.
Sure. Well, it reminds me of what we were talking about earlier, that I didn't fully understand my grandfather until I walked a mile in his shoes, figured by writing my own book. And I didn't come to the Lawton Childs story feeling ready to tell it until I had done a lot of walking in politics, that happened in 2004 when I volunteered in Florida on the John Kerry for President campaign. And I've done about 6,000 doors that summer in Central Florida. And I realized that, politics was a passion for me. I was a political science major in college. And that was also where I first heard about Lawton Childs that summer, that here was this politician who was literally putting his own boots on the ground, running through 4 or 5 pairs of boots, going 1,000 miles, and doing it with complete sincerity. That's the key. People often ask, oh, well, what if I walk, what about this guy who walked and he lost? Well, unless you have the deep sincerity, the ability to leverage those conversations on the road into true political power and momentum, and learn and be a learner in the way that he was on the road, it's not going to translate. It's not going to work. It will just be a gimmick. But I kept that story of Childs, the incredible walker, in my mind through college. And then as I was sifting through after college, the topics, okay, I'd like to do a first book. What's it about? He was on the short list. He was right there at the top. And then when I've contacted the Childs family and they said, there isn't a book available on it, no one's written it yet, that my gears really started turning, and the project began. Moved to Florida, moved to Tallahassee, lived there for a year, doing on the ground research. I really wanted to take advantage of the fact that he was a recent politician to make this an oral history campaign. I did about 100 interviews with former staff, family, friends. I very much did not want this to just be a library biography. Anecdotes, and not only for my own interests, but it reflected the way Childs was as a man, which he was a creature of oral history. He rarely wrote things down. He wrote some love letters, a few love letters, especially when he was serving in Korea, to his wife. But other than that, this was a man who loved the well-told tale. And people would tell me over and over, Childs one-on-one, he killed it. This was a guy who, he wasn't not a great writer, but you get a one-on-one talking politics with Lawton Childs, he's going to convince you of something.
And it's interesting that you said sincerity, right? That's what's missing in our modern, postmodern, our very sophisticated postmodern political world, right? And I don't care if you're on the right, I don't care if you're on the political left. People on the political left can find 10,000 examples, and usually they show up on MSNBC. Sorry, folks, but like people who are just being insincere, and everybody on the left knows that they're being insincere. And then you go to the political right, and usually, and by the way, those people now show up on Twitter. They, you got 10,000 people who are being insincere over there. And by the way, everybody on the political right knows it. Everyone knows, right? So this is not. We have long known that politicians could be venal. That's not a surprise. That goes all the way back to, like, good God, I mean, probably in Babylon, right? Like when the guy writing the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Like, I'm sure there was somebody running around going, that guy's full of nonsense. And we're going to go about our business and just ignore that person, right? So this is not this is a human condition kind of thing. But in America, what we have had, at least up until probably the 1970s, was the ability of people to be sincere. I love that. And to do things out of sincerity, like walk around and talk to people and get out there and get after it and really make an impact in people's lives. And I don't get the sense from the way you're framing this that Lawton Childs really cared so much about the office that he was going for. I get the sense he cared more about having those conversations and figuring out what people wanted. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think he genuinely loved people. That I suppose some politicians try to fake that, of course, but I think everyone, even the people who vehemently disagreed with Childs politically, knew that he was a real guy. There was nothing fake about him.
Well, and you're writing this in the space of, because this is 1970, right? This is his 1970 Senate campaign. I mean, this is the space where, if you place this in a historical context, Watergate's not quite here yet, but it's about to show up, and you're also at a spot where the end of the Vietnam War is not in sight, although everybody wants it to be in sight. So that's the historical context. But you're also having a turn in the baby boomer generation where fundamentally the 70s are about to show up, and there's some other economic things. There's some other poison pills that have been placed in the economy that the baby boomers were not aware of. And now they're going to have to do a pivot to deal with, well, welcome back, Cotter, to deal with inflation, to deal with high gas prices, to deal with the falling apart of the general sense of cultural incompetence, right? That sort of covers the 1970s, in addition to all of the dynamics around civil rights, social justice, environmental concerns becoming a more of a factor. And then, of course, the bane of my existence, disco. So there you go. All this now pops up, right? Like, please, can someone take Supertramp away and take them, just get them out of here. Get those guys out of here. So, you're at the cusp of all of this. And I do believe that politicians, just like writers, are built for a certain historical moment. And if they miss that moment, that's it, right? You can't be late and you can't be early. You have to be exactly on time. Whether we like that politician or not is an irrelevancy to your point. Whether we vehemently disagree with that politician or not is something that's okay. But you got to be at you got to hit your time. You got to hit that bell. And I think Senator Childs' campaign hit that bell at that particular moment. I know in reading, and I will be honest, I haven't read that book. I'm going to have to go pick it up. I've read summaries of it and done the research, but it seems as though once he got into the Senate, he was kind of, I'm going to use a big word here, disillusioned. Would that be correct? Okay. How did that sort of, in the postscript and the afterward, how does that sort of play out in later on in his political career? Because, he did this walking, he was sincere, he's connecting with people, he's listening to their stories, he really wants to represent them, they understand his sincerity, so they're going to cast votes for him. And then he leaves that pool of sincerity and jumps right into Washington, D.C., which is a totally different kind of thing. And sincerity doesn't play there. I think of the writer, I think it's Marshall Goldsmith, that said, what got you here and going to get you there. And now he has to make a shift, make a change, and so walk us through a little bit about how that happened, because I know you looked into a little bit into that.
Absolutely. That's a rich mind to tap. The I think it's one of the reasons that I love him as a person, as a human, is his vulnerability, his sincerity, of course, and one of the sincere dreams that he had from boyhood was being a U.S. senator. He idolized a very powerful old time conservative Democrat senator from Florida, Spencer Holland, who was from the same area that Childs was, Polk County, in Central Florida, and he had this portrait, I think, in his mind of a perfect political life, and the capstone of that life would be becoming U.S. senator, be joining the greatest deliberative body in the world, that famous tagline that people use. And I think it was from the beginning deeply concerning to him that Washington did not match that dream that he had in his head, and it dogged at him for years. And by his third term, by year 18, that was conclusive. That was and deeply painful and ruinous to his health, to his mental health, and that was why he retired. He realized that these little disappointments were pooling into something much greater, into clinical depression, and he was one of the first national politicians to be open about their struggles with depression, about taking Prozac, which at the time in the late 80s was brand new medication, and getting treatment and then recovering, and realizing that his early dreams were, they weren't wrong, but they were maybe misplaced. I think he realized that he was happiest at home in Florida, and for all his dreams of the ideals of legislative power, the executive, he found out, was really where his true heart was. He loved being governor, and it was just incredible interviewing his wife to hear about his wife Rhea, that struggle, and how he relocated himself and went from being, I think, a middle of the road, not enormously impressive U.S. senator to a very successful governor who evolved a great deal, especially for a man in his 60s. And yeah, the evolutions that he underwent, he was, like my grandfather, a learner of nature.
Well, I can sense that that's what again is that arc, right? The oral narrative, the good turn of phrase, the being able to tell a story. These are all things that you really deeply resonate with. It's attracted you to these kinds of projects, and working not only with the estate of your grandfather, but also working in sort of a space where those reverberations can have a real impact, and thus you put that passion into your work and into your writing about these areas. So we're kind of coming to a close here a little bit, and I think we've had a deep conversation here. I think it's been great. I've found out a lot more about John Dos Passos than I thought I ever would. Lawton Childs. I did not know nearly as much about him, and about his life and his experiences, and sort of the depth of his commitment to not only being senator, but also the commitment to what politics can do, and what leadership can do in that space. And so we are a leadership podcast fundamentally. So I'm going to ask you the leadership question here at the end of our conversation here. We do believe that, and this is why we read books of the past, We do believe that those books have something to say to us about the future. Does that mean that we're hidebound and captured by the past? No. It means that if you cut off the roots, the top of the tree or the top of the plant or the top of the flower, whatever you're cutting the roots off dies, right? Because there's nothing to sustain itself. We're at a weird moment in our culture where, and I think fundamentally something has shifted in the cultural zeitgeist where I can feel it. I don't know if other people can, and I might be just delusionally optimistic, but I think we've shifted towards something else. I've been talking about this on the podcast recently. There's 315 million of us in this country. About 80% of us only pay attention to, and there's nothing wrong with this, but only pay attention to our lives, the things that are going on inside of our box. And then the other 20% of us yell about things that are going on at the edges and in the center and in the middle. And sometimes that devolves into political discussions, and we all yell at each other, and it's gigantic chaos with the 20% of us. And the other 80% are like, what's the problem? I want things to work. Go away and leave me alone. And I think you need that 80 to balance out that 20. I do. You can't have 80% of the people just like yell. You can't. It'd be a mess down here. But I think at a certain point in that 20%, someone somewhere, and it's not anybody you can identify. I think it's just collectively someone calls time on an argument, and we all just sort of drift towards a conclusion. And I think we're in that someone called time somewhere. I think it happened in the last year and a half. And I think we're drifting towards a conclusion. I don't know what that conclusion is. I'd like to be delusionally positive. Not hyperventilating, but delusionally positive. I think that the conclusion is going to be positive, not negative. Another guest we had on the podcast recently, he's like, well, we could go into a dystopian Blade Runner future. Well, I don't think we're going there. I think we made a decision to go in a different direction. And I don't know if you're seeing that from where you are, but where I'm sitting, I'm feeling something shift in the zeitgeist. And I think it has to do with leadership. Not leadership, by the way, we just finished talking about Washington, D.C., not leadership from Washington, D.C. I think Washington, D.C. is being cut out of this. I think there's a cultural decision that's being made outside of that sphere of power. I also don't think it's a cultural decision that's being made in Hollywood either. They're being cut out of that decision-making process too. And I think rightly so at this moment in our republic. I think we down here have to do some things first. So that's a big contextual idea there. I kind of threw a lot of things at you. This is what I do. Just sort of frame this question as we close. What are some books in your grandfather's canon? I would obviously recommend USA Trilogy, but what are some books you can recommend to folks to read who are leaders, right? Who are the Lawton Childs, right? Childses of the world, right? Because I still believe those people are out there. I think they're running for mayor now, though. I think they're running for city council. I think they're running for school board. They're not aiming at anything higher than maybe their state or local government. And I think that goes along with that cultural zeitgeist shift, right? But it may just be that I'm seeing things in Texas, and that's my own bubble, and I might be delusional. So, what are some books that we can give to those folks that are inside of your grandfather's canon that can help them in making a decision about which way to go and what kind of leader to be?
Wow, that is a great one. I usually recommend that folks first stop in his canon is The Best Times, his memoirs, because it really provides a bold portrait, a very readable portrait of the man as well as the writer. And it's written in a style that I tried to emulate, that I studied thoroughly in preparing the magazine article about Provincetown for the American Scholar, which I would characterize that style as maybe a light thoughtfulness or an informal thoughtfulness. So it's this remarkable sweet spot of being light enough that you can read it at the beach, but heavy enough that you could study it in a scholarly journal and review it in a scholarly journal. It has all those attributes, and I think he maybe, you know, his resilience, his moderation, which I think are good leadership qualities. Leaders need to be resilient in times of crisis. That sort of balance in the style of the book, it reflects his own sense of peace, of sort of being at peace with the world. That he had this incredible sense of the ability to remain calm in crisis, and calm even at the center of this cyclonic, this swirl of geniuses with all their demons. And he was kind of that, maybe the eye of the storm, the calm. Yeah, so I would recommend that. I would also recommend Brazil on the Move, which is a underappreciated but very masterful nonfiction portrait of Brazil in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I would suggest that if you're an American leader, as part of understanding, appreciating the United States, is studying Brazil. They have so many things in common. They're vast nations with incredible abundance of natural resources, incredible potential, energy in their culture and their people. And in that book, my grandfather really explores what's one of the prevailing myths, legends of Brazil, which is Brazil has always been the country of the future. It's always 10 years away from being one of the leading nations in the world, finally making good on all those promises. And so there's sort of, we talk about the American dream, but I think there's also Brazilian dream that is very similar. And I think a lot of Americans would really benefit from spending more time with Brazil.
Awesome. We will have links to those two book recommendations in the show notes below the player of this podcast episode. We are recording this episode during the week where Christopher Nolan's latest movie, Oppenheimer, as they used to say back in the day, dropped, has been released. Nolan is a throwback director, doing things on film. And yes, sometimes he becomes telling stories on film and eschewing digital. Yes, sometimes he becomes self-indulgent. I'm looking at you, Tenet, by the way. Other times he tends to stay a little bit over get a little bit over his skis, but pulls it back at the end. I'm looking at you, Dunkirk. And then there's times when he hits it directly, nail on the head. Inception, Memento, some of his earlier films. As you can tell, I'm a huge Nolan fan. And so in the course of putting together this podcast episode, John graciously sent me an article that his grandfather wrote. It's kind of interesting. It's a biographical sketch. I guess that's the best way to frame it, right? Of Robert Oppenheimer, that your grandfather wrote, called Science Under Siege. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit of that as we close during this week of Oppenheimer? And by the way, if you're going to go watch the Barbie movie, God bless you, but go do the Nolan thing. You'll do better with that. Okay, so go ahead. Kind of walk us through Science Under Siege a little bit, and we'll maybe have a link to maybe the place where you can get this article. But go ahead and talk a little bit about Science Under Siege, because you said it was very rarely talked about, and that was sort of what piqued my interest on that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for lots of reasons. It's, if you're looking at my grandfather's life, all the different people he studied, it's an outlier as being maybe it isn't quite, maybe the best way to describe it is that talking this, the world of science and technology is something that deeply fascinated my grandfather, but it's far from being the number one or even the top five things that scholars talk about. And I think you see that sincere fascination and curiosity in the profile, that I think he really enjoyed this time, this opportunity to meet Oppenheimer, to sit with him for a while, and just kind of listen to his mind unspool for a bit. And I think you see in the informal style of, I think sketch is the right word, because it's pretty loose and not it meanders a little bit. I think the sense that I get in reading the piece is that my grandfather had a sense of just how much pressure Oppenheimer was under and had been under, the political microscope, the scientific microscope. I think he was trying to create a sense of familiarity, of a comfort level with Oppenheimer, where he could reveal himself a little bit without that he wasn't talking to a political reporter or a political journalist. He was talking to a longtime novelist who was not certainly not looking for a soundbite. And so it seems to me over the course of the profile that they found things in common, and that Oppenheimer did open up a little bit of his secret world. They found that between them, they both were fascinated by Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather loved Jefferson, wrote a lot about him. It does leave me wanting at the end. I wish that profile were a little longer and maybe had a follow-up. It's a bit of a mystery, but I love that it exists, because it just really, it shows just what a keen lover of variety was.
Yeah, I definitely got to the end of it and I was like, no, that's it. That's the whole thing. Like we're not. Okay, I guess that's all. I guess that's the whole thing. That was literally what I said. I was sitting on my couch next to my wife reading it, and I got to the end of it, and she's like, that was the whole thing. I thought it would be longer. Well, I don't know what to tell you. I guess there wasn't enough there in that moment. You definitely get the sense, and I will say this in closing, that there was an attempt by Dos Passos to kind of solve the cipher of Oppenheimer, and I don't know that anybody ever solved that cipher. And I do believe, again, just like politicians are made for certain political moments, I do believe that scientists are made for certain scientific moments. I do believe that that writers and authors are made for certain literary moments, right? Oppenheimer was a guy who was made for the moment. He was made for that at that time in American history, and quite frankly in world history. You needed that guy. Einstein wasn't going to put together the bomb. Like he wasn't that guy. He wasn't going to lead the Los Alamos project. He just wasn't wired that way. Like it just wasn't going to happen. And so who are you going to get? Right. Well, you're going to go get that shady gangster. You're going to go get that guy. And he's going to show up with his hat, and he's going to show up with his weird habits and idiosyncrasies. He's going to show up with a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, and you're just going to have to tolerate it, because guess what? At the end of all of that, you know what you're going to get? You're going to get something that's going to be, quite frankly, the destroyer of worlds. But you don't understand that at the time, and he's correct. I think of some of the things I've seen from the trailers of the movie. You don't know what you have until you use it, right? And a cipher is what brings that to you. And I think I think your grandfather sort of picked up a little bit on that, a sense of a little bit on that, but you're right. I don't think there was enough time to sort of explore that. And at that point in time in Oppenheimer's life, he wasn't allowing anybody to push on him because, he had Senate subcommittees chasing him around like Virginia jackrabbits, and he wasn't going to give anybody anything. He had to be cautious. And I really like the elements that were included there of his children, of Thomas Jefferson that you mentioned, all very fascinating. So I encourage folks, if they can find Science Under Siege, to check that out. It's very rare. I think you said it was like in a collection, right, of other writings by John Dos Passos. So if you can run across it, I definitely recommend reading it. All right. Well, typically we ask, would you like to promote anything today? Or is there anything you'd like to promote on the podcast? However, we will have links to the John Dos Passos Literary Estate. We'll have links to the John Dos Passos Society, links to the article in American Scholar. Is there anything else, anywhere else you'd like for people to go and find your writing, your books, your authorship, any other links we can include there for folks who are listening today?
I do have a website of my own, johndospassoscoggin.com. So as I publish poetry, new writing of various kinds, and as there are announcements relating to my grandfather's legacy, you will find also there news about that. So I can recommend that, but I do really hope that this is a chance for people to rediscover my grandfather's work and appreciate the varied and deeply fascinating, rich life that you led. Yeah, delighted to be here.
Awesome. Well, we want to thank John Dos Passos Coggin for coming on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Encourage you to go and check out all those links and check out the literary legacy of John Dos Passos, and of course the legacy as it is continuing into the now through John Dos Passos Coggin and through his work. Once again, here at the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we'd like to thank you for listening, and with that, we're out. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.